Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Georgetown University. It's a great honor and privilege for me, Father Jerry McGlone, to welcome you to our campus and our esteemed colleagues and just a stellar panel that Kim and John have arranged for us tonight. I am new to Georgetown University. I'm a senior research fellow at the Berkley Center for Peace, for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. As a Jesuit priest, as a treatment provider for both survivors and perpetrators, but also as a survivor myself of sexual abuse. I come as a professional who have advised lots of different people, from USCCB to the Vatican Commission, to lots of religious communities who are seeking to become safer. What are we here to do tonight? I think it's an amazing topic, Kim and John, that you've put together and with this panel. Essentially asking three questions: where are we now? Where do we need to go? And what are some possible directions for the future? It's organized by the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life, and it's the 8th gathering in the last year that has focused on lay leadership in the clergy sexual abuse crisis. I think it's fair to say, from my experience, this represents some of the most serious, sustained, and important efforts by any academic institution here in the United States. Part of what has been my experience in being here is just the enormous depth and range and diversity of opinions that find expression in these dialogues. The recent June gathering, I was stunned at seeing some of the best lay leaders from across the country gather to really point to what might be ways that we could really move forward. I was fortunate enough also when John invited me to speak in the Dahlgren dialogue about my own experience of being abused and what that meant for us in regards to making sense of what we need to do going forward. And I thank you, John, again, publicly. John is also a survivor, and so he knows what we go through when we start dealing with this topic. That each time that those who get fatigued and those who want this to somehow be something we move beyond, to a survivor, when they hear that, it's like pouring acid in our wounds. This coming Sunday, I'll be hosting at the Berkley Center an amazing sort of combination of lay leaders, the NRB chair, the National Review Board chair, Francesco Cesiato, and Dr. Len Sperry, who is the National Advisory Council chair. Francesco deals with the bishops, Len deals with all the major superiors in the United States. Then two wonderful lay women, Catherine Marshall of the Berkley Center and Kathleen Coogan, parishioner here at Holy Trinity, will be able to share their perspectives as to how they see us moving forward together. It'll be this Sunday at November 10th from 4:30 to 6:30 right here at the Berkley Center on M Street. Finally, my privilege is to introduce Kim and John as leaders of this initiative and organizers of this amazing conference that took place here in June on the National Leadership Convening. John has been the founder and director of the initiative, as I said before, a survivor of clerical sexual abuse and someone who worked at both the USCCB in areas of justice and peace, and he will moderate tonight's dialogue. Also, Kim, as the associate director of the initiative, Kim Daniels, has been an advisor to the Bishops' Conference, and now she also advises the Vatican. She'll lead off tonight's dialogue with a summary of the strategic directions coming out of this National Leadership Convening, which was held here at Georgetown University. And so if you would do us the honor of welcoming our panelists and also congratulating Kim and John on really leading the church nationally and internationally in this astounding effort.
Thank you all. Thank you, Father Jerry. Thank you all for being here, and thanks especially to our panelists for joining us here tonight. In his letter to the U.S. bishops, Pope Francis reminds us that we are not solitary pilgrims, for if one member suffers, all suffer together. The twin crises of clerical sexual abuse and leadership failure have led to horrific suffering for countless victim survivors and for the entire people of God, and they demand a faithful, urgent, and effective response. We're called to turn our anger and anguish toward finding a path forward towards protection, accountability, reform, and renewal. So this report we're issuing here tonight reflects one response to this call: the National Convening on Lay Leadership for a Wounded Church and Divided Nation, organized by the Initiative and held here at Georgetown last June. This convening wasn't just another conference. It drew together a diverse group of over 50 leaders from across the United States, heads of major ministries, heads of institutions and university presidents, leaders of lay efforts to respond to the clergy sexual abuse crisis, victim survivors, and leading journalists and scholars. Like other Catholic institutions, Georgetown has focused significant resources on responding to the abuse crisis. Our initiative has organized 6 distinctive gatherings, drawing some 1,500 people to address different aspects of the crisis. But this convening was different. After a year of revelations and reports, discussions regarding clergy sexual abuse, we invited a relatively small group of respected, experienced, and diverse leaders from across the country, not to listen to speeches and panels, but to sit down, roll up our sleeves, and engage in candid and strategic discussion on 4 linked goals. The first, to share, explore, and consolidate lessons learned from a year of focusing on this crisis. Second, to strategize about reform and renewal. Third, to examine the hidden costs, neglected costs of the crisis, and how to revitalize the church's voice in public life. And fourth, to explore how principles of Catholic social thought can help advance protection and accountability, faithful reform, and a renewed commitment to mission. So we had 2 days rooted in prayer and the sacraments. We built relationships, we strategized, and we looked for common priorities and actions, how we could refocus and revitalize the church and help to advance our common effort to focus on the clergy abuse crisis and lift up our public voice. We left with a shared understanding that this crisis is not over. For people in the pews, the anguish and the anger go on, and the jury is still out on whether the church's response will be effective in promoting accountability, transparency, and renewal. And I'm sure I don't have to tell those of you here that. One participant said, "I don't believe the bishops truly understand the anger of the faithful and the deeply rooted feelings of estrangement and loss that so many have." And these views, of course, aren't surprising. Clergy abuse survivors have suffered and continue to suffer crushing harms. Our ability to bring others to our Catholic faith has been weakened, particularly among the young. And our ability to live our mission and speak credibly in the public square has been hobbled. So on day 1 of our convening, we focused on lay leadership in a wounded church. We talked about what we could do to consolidate lessons learned on the abuse crisis. And on day 2, we focused on lay leadership for a divided nation and an exploration of the costs of the crisis for our voice in the public square. We had numerous specific recommendations from these sessions, and they're available in the full version of our report, some 50 pages, which will be online later tonight at catholicsocialthought.georgetown.edu. But tonight, I'm here to briefly summarize 10 major strategic directions that emerged from our discussions. So first, put victim survivors at the center of the church's response. As the church seeks repentance, justice, and reform, we must listen to victim survivors, their families, and all those affected by the clergy sexual abuse crisis. There are still not enough victim survivors in the rooms when decisions are made. The original sin of the clergy sexual abuse crisis was the failure to listen and believe victim survivors as they told us what had happened to them and the terrible harm it had caused, and the failure to act quickly and decisively here. Second, confront clericalism, overcome isolation, and support faithful clergy. As Pope Francis has said, to say no to abuse is to say an emphatic no to all forms of clericalism. Clergy sexual abuse cannot be discussed honestly without recognizing the toxic culture of clericalism. This self-reinforcing culture, which is often exacerbated by failures to embrace contributions from women, from those with diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds, and other underrepresented groups, is too often reinforced by lay people ourselves. People sometimes ask, what is clericalism? One simple answer is to point to Bishop Michael Bransfield's behavior in the Diocese of Wheeling, West Virginia as Exhibit A. Clericalism is unwarranted deference to clergy that can foster a sense of entitlement and superiority, and it can be fostered by clergy or lay people, and it can work on the left or the right. A culture of clericalism can lead to abuses of power and enable institutional cover-up of abuse. We need a new culture of candor that calls on lay people inside and outside of the church structures to both challenge clericalism and, very importantly, affirm the many priests and bishops who serve faithfully, selflessly, and pastorally. Third, hold leaders accountable and insist on transparency. While much remains to be done, this past year has seen some welcome developments in church law, practices, and policies aimed at accountability. But these partial steps towards accountability cannot take root unless church leaders internalize and embrace them, and in the process, change ecclesial culture and practice. And lay leaders must be involved to help hold church leaders accountable. Transparency is an essential tool of accountability, we found at the convening, and we should insist that bishops tell the truth with candor instead of making excuses or seeking to protect themselves or the institution. Participants noted that the speed and openness with which new procedures are carried out and the active and integral involvement of lay people are fundamental tests of ecclesial credibility. Fourth, focus on seminary formation. There was a shared view among the participants that seminary formation needs fundamental review and reform. Seminaries should be less isolating, more connected with the reality of local parish communities, and more open to lay participation, partnership, and feedback. Lay people should have a significant role in educating and assessing future priests. Fifth, promote and reflect the diversity of the church. The diversity of the church is, of course, a source of strength, not weakness, and it can and should ground our ecclesial life and our public witness. The church needs greater participation from those whose voices are too often underrepresented in church structures, including women, African Americans, Latinos, those from different economic groups, and those with different political or ecclesial perspectives. A diversity of voices will improve decision-making and help overcome a culture of clericalism. Sixth, focus on our gospel mission and build unity. The church needs to repent and reform, not simply to repair its institutional and ecclesial life, but also to renew and strengthen its capacity to preach the gospel, celebrate the sacraments, and care for the least of these. The church's mission will not be whole without overcoming the evil of clergy sexual abuse, and it will be the mission of the church carried out day by day, which can ultimately help restore trust and draw the support and confidence of the faithful. 7, bring in new voices to share Catholic principles in public life. Sexual abuse and leadership crises have severely damaged the credibility and impact of Catholic hierarchical structures in American public life. This is especially tragic at a time of national division when it is crucial that the voice of the church be clear and credible in defense of the poor and vulnerable, the unborn and the undocumented, and in advocating for religious freedom and for racial justice. New leaders need to step forward to share the church's social teaching and everyday experience, and lay women and men need to step up to the call to become salt, light, and leaven in the world. Yet too often, Catholic laity reflect their party or ideology more than their faith. This is a time for faithful, consistent, courageous lay leadership in public life. 8th, national collaboration among ministries. Catholic ministries and institutions were well represented at our convening, and they can help the church and heal divisions in our nation by focusing on our gospel call to serve the poor and marginalized. These ministries should look for additional ways to work together. 9th, build partnership and enhance collaboration among clergy and lay people. Bishops and clergy must work in partnership and co-responsibility with lay leaders, respecting their different vocations and utilizing their experience and expertise. This collaboration and the exercise of co-responsibility needs to be real and not merely rhetorical. There are many areas of Catholic leadership that do not require ordination, and it is imperative that lay women and men be encouraged to serve the church using their skills and expertise to help the body of Christ. Convening participants noted that it is long past time for church leaders to effectively seek increased leadership roles for Catholic women. Women bring important and distinctive perspectives to the table. A much greater involvement of women in church decision-making is a matter of justice and common sense. Failing to involve women in most institutional decision-making impoverishes the church's ability to make well-formed, effective decisions, and this is particularly true when it comes to decisions regarding the abuse crisis. Had more women been in the room, we would not be where we are today. And finally, be both humble and bold. We gain strength in our humility. All members of the church need to learn to listen more, reach out to others with differing backgrounds and perspectives, and move beyond ecclesial and ideological divisions to work together for the good of the church. This is a time for humility and openness. And at the same time, lay leaders have a real responsibility to boldly promote renewal and reform in partnership with bishops and priests, and to boldly live our mission to care for the weak and advance the common good in our divided nation. So those of us who participated in the convening are committed to focusing on our gospel mission, on building unity, and on service to the least of these. And in doing so, we stand together with the victim survivors of clergy sexual abuse and humbly pledge to work together to help ensure institutional integrity and accountability, and to find ways to repair, renew, and revitalize the church's mission in the world. We look forward to continuing to work together with our pastors and other leaders to help ensure protection and accountability, and to renew our church through a return to mission for our wounded family of faith in this divided nation. And now I'd like to turn it over to John to get your perspective.
Well, you've heard of the 10 Commandments. Well, now we have 10 directions. I was honored to be a leader of the convening. And as I've said on this stage before, this evil has haunted my personal and professional life for more than 50 years. As a high school seminarian, as a student at a college seminary, as somebody who's worked in a couple dioceses, somebody who's worked for the Bishops' Conference for many years, and now my work at Georgetown. And I have been a part of a lot of conversations, most of them very sad affairs, a lot of them hand-wringing, frustration and frustrating. In my experience, this was the most substantive, the most strategic, the most candid, and the most constructive discussion. One example, Jerry was very gracious, Father Jerry was very gracious in his praise. Father Jerry is a direct leader. In the space of about 90 seconds, he took on the Vatican, the U.S. Catholic bishops, and religious communities on what they have failed and what they needed to do. And he was one of 50 voices. So this was a remarkable experience. The good news is, if you're interested in those 10 directions and the work of the convening, as you leave tonight, you will get the first copies of the summary report of the convening. The other thing I want to say is, since we last met here, some really good things have happened and some not so good things have happened. You know me, as I'm a half-full guy. The Nationals won the World Series. In May, I was saying, my church is in crisis, my country is in chaos, and my baseball team is terrible. Well, 1 out of 3 isn't bad. One got better. My new favorite theologian, philosopher, is David Martinez, who, as you all know, said, I was there with my son the night they clinched the National League pennant, and he says from the stage, bumpy roads can lead to beautiful places. And I thought that's a great description of that. You know what? That does not describe this. This has been a terrible journey, not just bumpy roads. We've gone to places we've never wanted to be. And we are not yet at a beautiful place. But we can get to a better place. And I think the convening can help us get to a better place. And I think people like the members of this panel can help us get to a better place. If you're looking for the road ahead, this can provide a path. If you're looking for how to get there, I can't think of a better group than a survivor who challenged Pope Francis and persuaded him to take this more seriously as a global church. A bishop who came to a new diocese and listened to survivors and took up their cause and, in fact, dealt with the abuse of one of his predecessors quite directly. A journalist, Chris White, who has covered the problem, has covered our progress, and is covering now the continuing crisis in our midst. And a lay leader, the president of Trinity, Pat Maguire, who has spoken the truth to power when power wasn't listening and has defended the vulnerable and has talked about reform and renewal. So tonight, we're going to take this agenda forward by asking these four remarkable leaders two questions. Where are we now after so many revelations? The rumor is that the report from the Vatican and Cardinal McCarrick may be coming soon. We have been through that. We have had the resignation of our Archbishop. We have had new policies. We had the Vatican gathering. And we have the new and ongoing problems, Buffalo being an example. So where are we now from your perspective? And secondly, what needs to be done now by the U.S. bishops, by Pope Francis and the Vatican, and by lay women and men? So let me begin with the journalist who reports on these matters. Where are we now, and what are the next steps? Chris.
Well, I think in terms of where we are now, you mentioned the February summit that Pope Francis called, where he invited the heads of every bishop's conference from around the world. And the major fruit of that, of which I believe there are truly many, was Vos Estis, which is our new norms for bishop accountability. And those new norms require that every diocese in the world has a reporting system that is public, both to report abuse as well as its cover-up. So if in 2002 the bishops dealt with the abuse itself through the Dallas Charter, we now have norms for dealing with cover-up. And I'd like to think that it's a non-ideological fact to say that through Vos Estis, Pope Francis has done more than any other pope to really try to tackle the issue of abuse and implement norms to back that up. Now, the challenge, of course, comes with implementation. So what does that look like here at home? I think we have our first test case of Vos Estis in Minnesota. It's an allegation against the Bishop of Crookston there, who allegedly was pressuring a man that was training for the diaconate to keep quiet about his abuse and then sign a letter sort of recanting those allegations. That is underway, and one of the great things about Vos Estis is that it established time parameters. So we have a 90-day period in which this initial review is to take place. But as you mentioned, Buffalo is what many thought would be the real test case for Vos Estis. And when the when the investigation was initiated there...
Can you say more about what's going on in Buffalo, what the controversy is about?
So on October 3rd, the papal nuncio to the U.S., Archbishop Chirstopher, green-lighted an apostolic visitation to look into both the Diocese of Buffalo and particularly the bishop there, Bishop McGlone, who is charged with covering up abuse for well over a year. This has been going on. Numerous sort of seminarians as well as whistleblowers within the diocese have come forward to question his handling of that. Now, I think one of the things that the Buffalo case has allowed us to see is that many questions remain about the implementation of Vos Estis. When the apostolic visitation was announced, it was announced that this did not fall under a Vos Estis investigation. And so for some weeks there was speculation as to sort of would an investigation take place and how that might look. And so the fact that we didn't know what that would look like and even who was to trigger the investigation, whether it was to be the Bishop of Buffalo or the nuncio himself, I think it points to the fact that there there remains ambiguities in how these things play themselves out, even though the norms are in place there. That being said, Vos Estis was enacted ad experimentum for a period of 3 years, and so I think it's also important to remember that the church is undergoing this learning process. And so in 3 years' time, I think all of these things that are learned along the way should be kept in mind so that it can be further refined. I know we're short on time, but I think in terms of asking where we are now, I think the starting point is Vos Estis, issued by the Vatican last May, adopted by the U.S. bishops this past June, that began to provide a framework for both reporting abuse and its cover-up.
Good. Juan Carlos, you were at the in Rome at the outset of the February meeting. I'm going to ask you later for more specifics about your own experience and your conversations with Pope Francis. But what is your overall sense of where things are now and what needs to happen?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thank you, John and Kim, for inviting me, and to all our the panelists here, and Father Jerry. It's not funny, but it happens that every time I speak and I go somewhere like this, where people are interested, where people are sincerely looking for answers, where you talk about these incredible reports that you guys have worked on, it's very emotional for a survivor. I'm sure and not only for survivors, but for people who want this to end. We're not, as John said, in a happy place yet, but we want to get there. People ask me, like, how is this courage that you have? Or I don't feel I have too much courage, but I feel that this has helped me heal. And I want to do this and speak in front of you and speak everywhere I can, selfishly to heal myself, and because my faith is very important to me, but also to help others heal. And you can't blame other survivors to be incredibly angry and say terrible things, because it's a horrible journey, like John said earlier. It's not a pretty journey. I have friends that have committed suicide because they just couldn't move on and keep fighting. And so every time I speak here, I see them sitting in the audience. I see them sitting with me or with me, and it's I don't want to call it a burden or anything, but it is an important responsibility for me to represent others that, from the whole spectrum of difficulty. Some that, have kept the faith and are battling, some others that are in the worst place, and it's just so important for us, right? So when I see, in that summit that you're asking me about, I was honored to participate, but at the same time, it was very hard because you don't know if you're representing everybody. And what I saw there really challenged me. From the beginning, I thought nobody's going to challenge my faith because it's so important to me, and I'm here after thinking of even committing suicide because of my faith. Because to me, it's important. To me, it's a way to heal. Nobody's going to take that away from me. Nobody. No. And also, I want to say that when you talk about the church, when you talk about bishops, you can't put everybody in the same, sack, if you will. There's excellent bishops as well. There's all over the world, but there's the bad ones are really bad. And that's what I saw, John. When you say keep your faith and move on, it's really hard to keep your faith when you see what goes on. And we can talk later, but I truly believe that Pope Francis is doing the right thing. I've had conversations with him. I've been very fortunate to talk to him and not mincing words and being very direct but it's been shocking to me to see how many bishops go, nod their heads and say, yes, Holy Father, we're going to do this, and then go back to their diocese and continue the same terrible things that they've always been doing, and that Kim enumerated so well of, the horrible things that we've been going through. And how do we police that? How do we, vos estis, how do we make that happen? How do we make that a reality, right? It can't be that just Wyoming is doing something and some other bishops over there. And yes, the United States, many things are happening and we have advanced. We can't say that, nothing has happened. But you look at the rest of the world and it's not even begun. The tip of the iceberg has been, we've only seen that. So in my country, in Chile, we have 33 bishops, each one a criminal. I mean, each one has his own situation, things that they're doing. And no wonder Pope Francis asked them for their resignation, right? And already 8 have been kicked out and more coming, hopefully soon, right? Because that's the other thing. It's so hard to see this, so blatantly, these crimes happening in front of your nose, and action is so slow. I tell him that, and I've told him that. And there's this other whole situation that I saw so many bishops from all over the world, but some Americans that are criticizing Pope Francis and weaponizing survivors to pass their ultra-conservative agenda. And that is so hard to see, because the minute they obviously want to hurt Pope Francis, and yet they weren't there when the crisis was hot and things were happening. They were silent. But now it's useful to use survivors to hurt Pope Francis. And when they pass their ultra-conservative agenda, which is basically all they think about is you look at a rainbow flag and you're condemned. You don't say Mass in Latin, I'm exaggerating a bit, but that they'll drop survivors because we're passing our agenda. So for me, it was very hard to be looking at that reality and knowing survivors in Peru, knowing survivors in Costa Rica, knowing survivors all over the world that tell us and use me as some person that can help them in any way. I wish I could do more, and see that they are not getting the help they need because there's all this other politicization. I don't know if that's the right word, but the politics of this weaponizing of survivors. That is dangerous, and we cannot allow that. So that's why when Kim is reading all these wonderful things that we have to do, let's focus on how we implement this and forget about weaponizing survivors or using them for this or that. There's TV stations, there's sites that all they do is criticize Pope Francis by weaponizing survivors. The damage they do is terrible. So anyway, thank you. Sorry.
All right. Pat, I'm going to ask you a more specific question about our situation here in Washington. Mm-hmm. But in general, where do you see us? Where are we now? Mm-hmm. And what are the next steps? You were a very active part of the convening.
Yes. And thank you, John. And that was just so powerful, what you just said. When there's an earthquake, there's immediate damage and terrible things happen to people. But sometimes the worst damage is out there in the ocean where the ripples begin. And you don't see it coming until the tsunami comes and wipes out villages on the shore. I think we've had a terrible, terrible earthquake in the church, which has caused so much pain and so much immediate damage. But I don't think we're looking at the ripples out there at all yet. And I think where we are right now is the collateral damage from this scandal is enormous, and we can't begin to understand it. I wrote about and told the story of my own mother, the mother of 5 boys, 2 girls, the girls, 5 altar boys in Philadelphia. And in her final dying days when I was with her, she would lay in her bed and say, "Pat, do you think something bad happened to the boys?" And she went to her grave thinking that, and I would go and call my brothers and say, "She's at it again. Did anything happen?" "Oh no, nothing happened." My mother went to church every single day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, sat in the front pew with her big rosaries, which drove the pastor crazy because she was saying the rosary during Mass. But she was the quintessential woman who was the pillar of the church. And I think she was emblematic of the women of the church, not the crazy people on the left like me, but the women in the center who were the pillars of the parishes, the women who felt totally betrayed, upset, fearful, concerned. Did something happen to the boys? Or the girls, perhaps? The betrayal of trust of the faithful in the center is the worst collateral damage of the scandal, because that is the support for the church. I had one other reflection as I've thought about all of this, watching the bishops' meeting with the Pope last year or earlier this year. And all of a sudden, one day I was reading some of the news reports, and it occurred to me, those men know nothing about me and the women I work with every single day, and I really know nothing about them. I don't know priests, really. I don't have that much interaction with them in a predominantly women's institution, except for Mass and sacraments. And more to the point, they don't know us, because in the history of our church, most of us men and women did grow up in single-sex institutions before coeducation became the norm. The separation became a wall that made it impossible for those men to know us and for us to know them. And this is the problem of clericalism, and it's the place where the dialogue has completely broken down. How can the bishops meet and talk to each other and not talk to the rest of us to find out the damage, the harm, what really has to occur, not for people carrying picket signs, but with all of us here in this room, with the women like my mother, who will never say it out loud to a priest, but who will say within the family, "Did something bad happen to the boys? It has shaken my faith." And I think that's where we are. I don't think we've begun to address that.
Bishop, you arrived in Cheyenne, 2 years ago? And you grew up on in South Dakota. I'm from Minnesota. They think we go to high school together. You got degrees from important institutions. You went to the North American College. You have served in rural city parishes on reservations. And you arrive in a place that has an open wound regarding the behavior of one of your predecessors. So rather than ask you in general where we are, although I'd welcome your comments on that, especially the meeting coming up next week, but what have you had to deal with? What have you learned in dealing with a local church that has been hurt in the ways that have been described by Pat and Juan Carlos?
Maybe I should give a little background. I'm not sure how many people actually know the situation. So in the Diocese of Cheyenne, already in 2002, in fact, the same year as the Dallas Charter, it was made aware that there is some allegations against the bishop had just retired, Bishop Joseph Hart, Those allegations primarily coming out of his diocese as a priest in Kansas City, St. Joseph. 5 at that time, between then and 2014, there were 2 settlements, one in 2008, one in 2014. And Bishop Hart was named as one of the people who was named by 6 individuals. One of the individuals was from Cheyenne, but the other 5 were from that Diocese of Kansas City, St. Joseph. So in coming in, I was already made aware of that from the previous bishop who was there, now Archbishop Paul Aitchen. And really, I inherited some good work from him. He read the file. He listened to some family members and said, I need to look at this file. He wrote to the Vatican and said, I am asking for an investigation to be opened. And so he did some good work. And really, I think I've been able to take that obviously farther, but he really did do some good work. And sometimes, that's not mentioned. The day I was ordained a bishop, I received a summary of that information. Helped my prayer a little bit that day. But I received that summary, and it was obvious after then taking that summary with some internal people. I had a really good team of a vicar general and a judicial vicar, some legal counsel, and a lady chancellor. We really looked things together, and I inherited a very good diocesan review board with really excellent people, and consulted hard with those folks. And at the end of the day, decided that we needed to take another step. And I was ordained in June. In September, I went to Rome. It happened to be that when I went to Rome for the new bishops meeting, Cardinal Sean O'Malley was there. So I asked for a meeting with him, and we met alone in Santa Marta. And then I met individually with Cardinal Ouellette from the Congregation of Bishops, and then I met with the folks from the CDF, who did indicate that I could do more fact-finding. And so brought that home, continued to talk about that with that very good, again, very excellent review board and that internal team. 2 of those priests that I mentioned were ordained by this man, but they were honest and they were clear and people of integrity in the middle of a very painful thing for them. This is the man that ordained them. So we decided to open a new investigation, or to open an investigation that would kind of really continue the fact-finding. So it's been rather intense way to start being a bishop. Some of the bishops, when we finally made a press release about 6 months later, we made a press release in July of 2018 that we had 2 substantiated allegations. Some bishops had known this man for 40 years as a bishop. They had a hard time hearing that and didn't say much. But I knew that they were struggling with why I would do that. Some of the people in the diocese have known this man for 40 years. It's a little different than the McCarry case because he was served in a number of dioceses. This is a man that's now been in the Diocese of Cheyenne for 43 years. And so a deep, deep relationship, more of a relationship like a pastor who served in a parish for 40 years. And so people in the legal profession, people in the leadership level of Cheyenne's state capital, and they had a very difficult time with this. That's kind of the local scene. I can reflect a little bit on what I think we've learned largely.
Can I just ask you, there were obviously lots of reasons not to do what you did. Why did you reopen things? Why did you refer your predecessor to Rome and to the authorities?
And again, I want to come back to that internal team. It wasn't just me. We really had honest, frank conversations. Sometimes they told me I should not do something, which was good advice. At the end of the day, we came to this determination. This case is a big cloud. It's neither settled for the bishop, the diocese, or the victims. And they need clarity, and we need clarity as a diocese, because there had been settlements. And when I went to Bishop Hart and I said, listen, I went to him before I was ordained because he wanted to be in the ordination. I said, you settled, and your diocese settled. He said, oh yeah, we did that just because, well, we didn't, it wasn't because I abused, he said. We did that to settle and to just get it done. Those aren't his exact words, but his point was that there was no abuse. But it was unsettled. It was a cloud. And even the victim that we knew from Cheyenne, which is really the one we knew more than anyone, we didn't have such good contact with those others. It was unsettled for that family, and there are family members that are living in Cheyenne today. His mother lives there. I go for a walk, I see his mother. So because it was unsettled, and we thought it was only fair long-term for clarity and justice to say, what happened? Can we get to the bottom of this for the victims, for the diocese, and really for Bishop Hart?
Well, I want to get to your overall comments. What was the response of victims, survivors that you talked to about this?
They've been so appreciative. They've been so appreciative, but I've found myself, I've gained from meeting them. I've met some amazing human beings. Even the lawyer that we hired to investigate this case, when he ended up interviewing the key victim, he said, this is a man who's articulate, who has perseverance, he really is an amazing human being. He speaks, he said, I don't care, I don't want to see Bishop Hart go to prison. That's not what I want. And at one point he said, and I know he's a good man, and he's done a lot of good things. And I said, that's really a mature man that can say that. He said, it's hard. I have to work hard to say that. I've met some amazingly good people and have been moved, and I think victims are starting to find their voice, and it's a beautiful voice, and it's helpful for other victims. That's one of the things that I've had a number of victims write to me out of the blue from other places. I had somebody from Salt Lake City send me $10, say, thanks for what you're doing, keep it up. Not abusing the church, abusing her family. And most of the people who have written me actually are not abusing the church, they're just
well, and my sense is you pay a price for that with some people locally and frankly with some other bishops. Let's go back. The bishop talked about the remarkable story of the victims. Your story, oldest of three in Chile, you were abused by your pastor. You wrote a letter to the Pope, and the Pope dismisses it, says that you're lying. And somehow you find your way in a room with the Pope telling your story and play a decisive role, it seems to me, in getting the Holy Father to see this in a different way. How did that happen? How did you go from being attacked by the church, dismissed by the Holy Father, to sitting across from him, telling him what happened to you for hours, and then him demanding the resignation of those 31 bishops? What happened? How did it happen?
I wish it was so simple to tell, and I talked enough, but first of all, I want to say something, Bishop. I want to thank you. Seriously, I rarely have the opportunity to do this, and I want to thank you, Bishop, for what you have been doing and what you do, because you're right, it means so much to survivors, and it means so much to survivors maybe not affected by the person you're investigating, but survivors who see someone doing something, because for so long we've seen nobody doing anything. And also, I want to say maybe, and I never want to be arrogant, and I'm not that way, but humbly I want to say also, we can't expect every survivor to be like the marvelous person you met, because that's putting a lot of heavy burden and difficulty on survivors who to be heard, and I know you're not saying that by any means, because I really, truly grateful for you. But there are people who believe that, survivors have to be well-behaved to be heard and to be, taken seriously and all that. Many times, survivors are incredibly hurt, and they are suffering a horror that's unspeakable, and that many of us cannot even begin to understand what happens inside that person. And that, to your question, I was one of those, with an unspeakable pain, with an unspeakable confusion, and feeling that the world hated me. And the reason, and in a nutshell, I think, Pope Francis heard us, because it wasn't, but I wrote the letter, yes, but he also heard a lot of other people. Providence, happened that he eventually realized that he called me in January of 2018 when he went to Chile, and I was visiting Santiago, and in those days, obviously, we have a foundation there, and we help survivors. And he said, you three are liars in front of the world. Why? And I've completely forgiven him for that, because it was all these bishops and one named Cardinal Francisco Javier Errázuriz, who was the Archbishop of Santiago, and Cardinal Ezzati, another Chilean cardinal. Both those men, especially the first one, had known Pope Francis since he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, so they had, struck a friendship, and it's, close by cities, Santiago, Buenos Aires, they met in every meeting that they had. And Cardinal Errázuriz is a criminal, and he not only covered up our case, but covered up so many other cases, and an abuser himself. And so it is, you understand, kind of, I tried to, understand that the Pope was very poorly informed because he trusted these people. He had known them for so many years, and naive or not, he didn't know that they were the type of people they were. And so I was able to tell him that to his face. And when I spent a week with him in Santa Marta, and he listened to me, he put out this letter apologizing to all of us, and he said to the world, I have committed a grave mistake. And it's not often that you see a pope admitting something like that. And that's my personal reaction. I understand other people that don't react the way I do. But this is how I decided that my way of healing, like I said before, and because I feel that my faith is so important to who I am and what I am, and to see so many good people in the church being destroyed by this horror, it was important for me to talk to him, to spend time with him, to hopefully help him understand, and other people had done the same. And we saw a 180-degree change after that, and it was, I hope so many other survivors could feel what I felt, and I believe that he's the right person to help us with this. I believe also, like I said before, that we have to change so many bishops' hearts to do what they're supposed to do, like you, Bishop, do what you're doing. And we don't see that. We don't see that. There's scandals all over, and many, many more to come.
Why do you think you were able to break through? What touched, you said his heart and his mind are changed. What do you think changed?
I think just sitting in front of a survivor and telling him like it is without, the first day I saw the Pope, I said so many bad things about the Pope and about all the bishops, and I was so angry, but yet when I went all cocky, and I'm gonna tell him like it is, like thinking, and then I get my room in Santa Marta, and the Pope lives in the next floor, and I'm thinking, what am I doing here? And but yet I had all those survivors that I told you earlier that I felt were with me, and I had to have the opportunity. It was a heavy, heavy burden in my heart, but I felt that I had to speak to him and prayed that my words could have an influence or have some kind of echo in his heart. And the first time I saw him, I was like, obviously awestruck, like, this is the Pope. You see this man and said, "Hi, Juan Carlos, how are you?" I'm like, "How are you?" I didn't know if to kneel down or be like a Persian rug or what. I don't know. It's like, "Hi, Holy Father." And then we sat down for 3.5 hours, and I told him my story. I didn't at the beginning it was formalities, and he started, but then I just opened up and I said, I'm never going to have this opportunity again, and this is for me, but mostly for every man and woman who has been abused, dead, alive, I don't know, I have to do something and help him understand. And, after those 3.5 hours and a week of talking, this new person came out, and I was amazed.
Thank you very much. Thank you for doing that, and thank you for sharing it.
So many people, it's not just me.
Pat, I think everyone knows you have received more awards. You're on the list of most powerful leaders in Washington, the most powerful women, the most powerful educators. You've been a college president almost 30 years. Most of them last about 3. You have transformed Trinity in a way that makes us all proud of Catholic higher education. You quoted that story of your mother, which I read in a remarkable piece you wrote called Cardinal Sins. But also in that piece, you talked about the damage this is doing to the church's voice in public life. Yes. For the undocumented women or the DACA women that are part of Trinity or their families, or for the poor families miles from here. What do you think? You talked about the ripples. How have the ripples undermined the voice of the Catholic community at a time when our country needs to hear about human life and dignity, needs to hear about justice and peace, needs to hear about immigrants and refugees? Right. What are the costs in that area, and what could we do about that?
Well, I think the costs are tremendous, and I think this is part of the crisis we face right now in the church and in our country. Let's face it, most of us have never lived through a political moment such as we're seeing in the country, and it's not just politics, it's really about how we choose to live our lives in the kind of communities of hope and justice we have an opportunity to build. And this is a moment where the church's voice is so urgently necessary and yet is so compromised because of this scandal. I had occasion in March to conduct a workshop for the principals of the Catholic elementary schools of the Archdiocese of Washington. And I think it's very important to understand the impact of all of this on the people who do the actual work of the church out there in the pews and in the schools. So these are elementary school principals, and I asked them, we were doing a little PowerPoint thing, so I was doing a little poll, and I asked them to describe in a word what their feeling was about the sex abuse scandal in the church. And they put a word cloud up as they answered. And the words were disappointed, disgusted, betrayed, outrageous, and it just flowed. And it grew into this huge word cloud, 59 principles with not one having anything except the most negative, damaging words to say. And we talked about it afterwards, and I said, you are the leaders of the education of the children, and how do you get past this so that you can take us to a different place and take our children to a different place? And this is what I heard, and it parallels what I was feeling and what other Catholic educational leaders have felt, who I have talked with. Nobody throughout this whole scandal, nobody in an official position in the church ever reached out to us. I asked the principals, did you meet with the bishop? Did he reach out to you? No. Every letter that came out from the cardinal, unfortunately, was addressed to dear brother priests, and it was not addressed to any of us who are actually doing the work of the church in the schools, in the elementary schools, the high schools, in the colleges and universities. Now, what does this mean related to speaking out about the issues of the day? Well, if you don't support your people who are doing the work, and you don't help them find their voice to speak out about the issues of dignity of human life, solidarity, option for the poor, all of those principles of Catholic social justice, which it is our job to teach our pupils, and we're feeling so disgusted, then how does the mission of the church get passed on to the rising generations? How do we do this? Now, we talked about this with principals because we can't just leave it there in a place of feeling angry and disgusted and betrayed. But I was shocked by how intense those feelings were from the educators in our archdiocese. And there is a tremendous need for healing in a group like that, because they are part of the future of the church and the children they're teaching as well. And by the way, there's all these other needs while we're talking about this scandal. There are principals trying to hold it together in schools that are inadequate, and they have inadequate resources. So when we talk about the justice needs of the people who the church serves, whether it's my DACA students or the principal down in far southeast whose kids play in an alley because there's no playground for them to play on, there are so many other needs of the church and the ministries of the church, but all of the time and effort is consumed in what many of us on the outside looking in see as self-protection, self-absorption, clericalism, an echo chamber where the men are talking to each other and they're not reaching out to hear the rest of us. And that is that problem I said earlier and say again, and that was the problem I heard from the educators I talked with in March.
We're going to come to you for questions, if you could put out the mic. But first, I want to turn to Bishop Biegler and Chris White. Chris, you covered the February meeting. You covered last year's bishops' meeting. You're going to cover the bishops' meeting next week. Where do you see the next steps? You're also covering the progress that's been made and the problems that remain. What are the choices, the decisions that are going to be made? And then I'm going to ask Bishop Biegler to talk about, we have talked about supporting bishops and priests who make the right choices. How do we build relationships? How do we support what's right and challenge what's wrong? A lot of lay people participate in clericalism by how we treat our bishops and our priests. But first, Chris, what's the road ahead? And then to the bishop, how do we deal with this instead of just complaining about it?
Well, in my first answer, I feel like I dealt with sort of the clinical stuff. So let me just make a broader observation, if I may, and it's that in 2013, when Francis was elected Pope, the papacy, the church, at large, was sort of covered by a cloud of scandal then. And then almost overnight, Francis had won the hearts of much of the world. And how did he do that? He did so immediately by being the Pope of gestures. And those gestures, of course, I think hint at something, very substantive. But, he travels to Lesbos and he brings back migrants with him. And so I would say if both the leadership of the U.S. Church at the level of the bishops, but also lay leaders want to really sort of recapture their prophetic voice, there's got to be more creativity in how you reclaim that. It doesn't just happen via statements. They're a starting point, a roadmap perhaps. But, where are the gestures that, the Catholics that Pat just mentioned that are in their, classrooms working with kids? What can they point to as a real sign of solidarity? It's not my job to figure that out. I just report on it, so. You can figure that out, Bishop.
Bishop, you're making 2 trips from Cheyenne to the East Coast, one for this wonderful discussion tonight and one for the bishops' meeting next week. What's the connection between what we're talking about tonight and that meeting? How do we both affirm the priests and bishops who are taking the advice, following your example, and how do we challenge those who are stuck somewhere else?
I think I don't know if I wouldn't maybe categorize us in those, clearly in those groups. I think all of us need to continue to grow. All of us, as in all of us, all clergy, all lay people. I mean, not that the clergy don't have their own, and the bishops wouldn't have even a more pointed areas of growth. As I thought about it, I came back to that second paragraph in Vos Estis Lux Mundi, where Pope talks about conversion. I have that paragraph in front of me just to read that for everybody. The crimes of sexual abuse offend our Lord, cause physical, psychological, and spiritual damage to the victims, and harm the community of the faithful. In order that these phenomena never happen again, a continuous and profound conversion of hearts is needed, attested by concrete and effective actions that involve everyone in the church. We've come a long way in a lot of ways. That's fair to say. I mean, we've, in the meetings that you've had, and Leadership Roundtable also led a large gathering to identify the twin crises. I think now we've just begun maybe to
Tell us about the twin crises. Not everybody
just
knows the shorthand.
Just simply that there's a crisis of actual sexual abuse and a crisis of the leadership and its failure to really address that appropriately. And together with that, I think we've just begun to understand the broken trust. One of the images I use for the broken trust for myself, and I've used it for years, is if you can imagine a family that has worked hard to accumulate a real strong business and really grow that business, and they've got all these earnings, and some kid comes along from that family and spends it all in 1 year. And the bishops or the priests or the clergy, whoever they were, who abused, they took all that trust that had been built up, all that trust, they capitalized on it. And they've spent it in a large way. And I don't want to leave there on a hopeless note because, people, right now, who do people follow or look to? They look to their pastor to see if he's a good man, see if he's a person of integrity, see if he's a person who serves. We know that. They'll look to the bishops in the same way. We've identified the crises. We have a much clearer understanding of statistics of sexual abuse. The victims are beginning to find their voice. Those are real positives. We've established sound policies, Vos Estis, the peak really of that, of what we've done now that applies to the universal church. But those are not the most important things. And I would say the thing that we need to work on is conversion. That would be how I'd answer the question, what needs to be done now by the United States bishops, by Pope Francis, the Vatican, laymen and women, a continuous and profound conversion. And I would list that in 3 areas. One is that it's not that we only need to know the statistics of abuse. We need to see the reality of that sexual abuse with eyes wide open and let it really pierce our hearts. That how evil it is, how it wounds people for life, and the spiritual and psychological malady that has those components of a narcissism often, a sense of entitlement, the denial that goes with it, to really see that for the seriousness of what it is. Again, that would be a conversion regarding the abuse itself, to let it really hit us. Not everybody, I speak to people who will say, we released our paper with the names of those who abused, and a woman called me who was so angry because we listed a priest she loved, and she said about a person who was abused, it couldn't have been that difficult. And I'm not sure how someone could say that after all this has happened. So second level of area of conversion for me is really look at leadership. Since 2002, we've worked hard to change policy, and the environment is moving and changing. But I think we can't be satisfied with implementing policies only. We must be a guardian of the least. Bishop, the word episcopal, the word in Greek for episcopal means a guardian, one who watches over and guards the flock. And that's that social thought, to say, what do we pull from our social thought to say, we're not just implementing policies, but there's a whole different heart or mind of someone who implements policies versus someone who guards the flock, and especially the least, and especially to see victims as the least. There's a conversion, I think, that needs to happen there. Not with bishops particularly, but I think I've had some conversations with priests that I've just shocked that that I don't hear that guardian mindset of, these are our children.
Thank you.
Third area of conversion is to really put victims at the center. We've talked about that. I find that we have a long way to go, and we've only just begun. And I say that with everybody involved. I just think that we have not had them at the center, and I don't think we can expect that that culture is going to shift overnight with a policy. It's shifting. To our credit, it's shifting. But the last thing I would say is this. God uses our sins. God is bigger than our sins. And one of the things I dream for the church is that we would be a healing church, not just for those who have been harmed by us. Providentially, I think, one of the things that's happening is God has allowed this wound to be revealed. The church could be a healing place for all who have been harmed by sexual abuse. What if in 10 years they were flocking to us because we were the best place to come to be healed?
Well, one of the things, go ahead.
There's a bit of ways to go, Bishop, but I thank you for that. But you know, one thing that I see all over the world, and I'm so grateful, Bishop, again, that you are doing so much, and it's just inspiring, and obviously Pat and Chris and John and Kim and Father Jerry, all of you doing so much. It gives a lot of hope. But around the world, and bishops in Chile, I'm a U.S. citizen. I live here, and I've been here 17 years, but I'm in Chile constantly, and I have a foundation there with 2 friends. And I've been lucky to go speak in Peru, in different countries. And if I hear one more bishop say that they're in a learning curve, and that they are, in 1980, 1990, we didn't have the protocols to deal with this. We didn't know. And I said it before. I mean, raping or abusing a boy or a girl before Christ was wrong. After Christ, in the Middle Ages, now and tomorrow will be always wrong. So where's your common sense? You don't need a protocol to deal with something so horrible and do something about it. So that's no excuse.
Now is the time for folks to raise a question. I have my standard qualification. Please put your question in the form of a question.
I'll do my best. My name is Pat Malone. I'm a lawyer here in Washington. I sue people for a living. And what I'm not hearing tonight is a concept of the rule of law. So that we move beyond the cult of personality, good bishops, bad bishops, and have rules of procedure. We call them the federal rules of civil procedure. They're promulgated, they're out there for everyone to see, and they have guidelines for how these things are handled. If you want to see the Bishops' Conference do something that will be meaningful to people like me, let's move beyond the fancy words to something very concrete and specific, where you tell us how you're going to handle cases so that it doesn't just depend on being in a good bishop's diocese so that something gets done or it just drops into a hole somewhere. Rule of law, that's what we want.
Okay. I think that's a point well taken and not a question, so we'll move on.
I'm Skip Horvath out of Virginia for the bishop. Why are the U.S. bishops so afraid of lay people? For instance, at the June meeting, there was this big discussion. I watched the whole streaming from beginning to end. Big discussion about the word will. Lay people will be involved in setting up this third-party reporting system. It was rejected for the word should. Then afterwards, the bishops got together and individually signed a pledge saying, we bishops signing this document individually will involve lay people. So is it, and this is not a trivial question, because the point is, I know they do talk about, so when they're designing this new third-party reporting system, they're consulting the National Review Board. They do have some lay people, but it's handpicked. In the normal course of, say, a government putting together a proposal that's going to affect the whole country, it's put out for public comment and notice. Everyone can comment on it. It's all gathered. It's all very transparent, and everyone knows the timeline. With the bishops, it's all being done quietly and just among themselves. There is nobody that really, you don't know what's going on until they finally announce it. So what is it? Is it canon law? So that's my question. Is it canon law that prevents them from involving lay people at their own high level? Or is it more of a culture, as we talked about earlier, of clericalism that says we know best for the people, we're the shepherds? Or is it something else entirely?
Great. Couple things. One, I would add, we got several people in limited time, so let's do two at once. Come forward, ask your question. The other thing, I'd like Kim to answer all the hard questions. So, because obviously she knows a lot. She's an advisor on these matters, but share your question and we'll go back to will and should and lay people.
Okay, sure. Hi, I'm Jane Varner Malhotra. I work here at Georgetown, and I'm also a graduate student, so I'm going to stick with my graduate student status, so I retain my job, when tomorrow. I love Georgetown. But I wanted to, my question is, why am I here? And I'm going to partially answer it myself, because I've been coming to these for the last several years, particularly the last year, and I'm glad that we convene them, but I really think we're all asking for concrete action. And one of the things I like to recommend to everybody in this room, and it might cause us to gasp, but that points to our own clericalism, is stop calling anybody excellency. And secondly, I have one father, that's my dad. I love him, he's great, I'm calling him dad, but I'm no longer calling anybody father. And, it gets uncomfortable sometimes here at Georgetown, but most of the Jesuits here are very understanding of that, or maybe they haven't even noticed it. But I ask everybody in this room to think about that, because when we raise somebody up, we also hold them to a standard that not any one person can maintain, particularly particularly excellency. And as part of that, in the last year, I've done a lot of soul searching, and I'm going to try to speak this next part so it sounds like a question to trick John Carr, because whenever I come up, he always says, let's ask all our questions 2 or 3 at a time whenever he sees me. So it's with great affection that I state this next thing and try to make it sound like a question, which is, there's been a group of us in the Washington, D.C. area who have started holding home masses led by Roman Catholic women priests as part of the Women's Ordination Conference. We have done this work kind of quietly, and now we've started to do it in public parks. We've had 2. They're called Mass on Mass. We hold the Mass. Is this a question? Does it sound like a question? Yeah. Just down the street from the Vatican Embassy and on Massachusetts Avenue. It's therefore the name. But the group is called Washington Home Inclusive Monthly Mass. It stands for WIM, because we need an awkward acronym because it's in DC, so we have to. But if you look up WIM with 2 M's, dc.org, you'll learn more about this organization. There are many people who work at Georgetown who are a part of it. We're from parishes all across DC and Maryland, and we started with 15 people on an email list in January, and now we have over 300, and people are looking for something concrete to do. So thank you for everybody coming out on another Monday night to be here.
All right. So, will, should, laity, excellency. I insist on being called Your Eminence. I think that would be particularly appropriate. And I'd invite the bishop or Kim to take a stab at either one of these.
Well, why don't I just jump in real quickly? And what I hear from a number of these initial questions is, what are we actually doing? Like, what are we actually recommending? We've been talking for a long time, and what we want to get to is action. And so I think that one of the things I'd say to you is, we outlined 10 different strategic directions, right? But when you get under the directions, then you have specific recommendations, and they're throughout our report. There are a number of different things you can point to, and one of them is the very practical points that we heard here earlier about not using terms like Your Excellency and not using terms like Your Eminence and the other kind of attributes that go along with an old culture of clericalism that we don't necessarily need. In a more direct way, we talk about a number of different things. Performance appraisals for priests like we would have and bishops like we would have in any other profession. Management training and best practices like the Leadership Roundtable has been encouraging and helping bishops and priests implement. More better screening of seminarians. Developing a theology to back all this up. Addressing the backlog of cases at CDF, improving record keeping and communication, looking at schools as examples of clerical lay partnership, because this kind of thing has happened before. So there are all sorts of specifics that we can get to. As to the question of how do lay people get involved, right? How do we mandate lay involvement? There are lots of difficult canonical questions here. And I'm not a canon lawyer, I'm a regular lawyer, and I'm not going to pretend to be one or answer them up here. But what I will say is this: changing the kinds of rules that can help us get increased lay leadership requires leadership on the part of our bishops. It requires people pushing for change, and that's a hard thing to do, and I would ask that that's something that we call for in the report, the participants for the convening called for as well.
Bishop?
Well, I know that the will and the should argument was regarding canon law and what was acceptable in the universal church canon law. Nevertheless, I also know that there were a number of bishops, myself included, who are absolutely convinced that I couldn't have done my job without a really, really, really good lay board, review board. So I don't know, and that's what that's about briefly. Before I was ordained, I specifically asked people would not call me Your Excellency.
Let's
think
do
it's a good point.
2 at a time. And again, question?
How can local churches support survivors?
Great question. Great. You take that.
A former member of the faculty here, Dr. Gerard wrote in an article in Time magazine in August 2018, about 13 months before he died, And he spoke about the need for a collective act of public repentance by the church in the US, I think, and throughout the world. And then secondly, about the need for pointing to the resignation of Mary Collins, about the need for greater lay leadership in the commission appointed by the Pope. So where are we on those two concrete suggestions from the late Dr. Mannion? Thank you.
Okay. We miss him terribly. How can local communities help survivors, and what about repentance?
I would say shortly that each one of us can help survivors so much. Maybe there's survivors in the audience right now, and maybe you haven't dared to even speak out because it's so hard. Understand that anybody around you could be a survivor, and be open to, if you suspect or you, to open your heart to that person and lend a hand. Not in a patronizing way, not in like, I'm here to heal you, like just let them speak. In terms of local communities, what they could do is, first of all the things we've all talked about and that Kim said so well, how pastors should be trained from now on, or from a long time ago on. But at the same time, I would say pastors, bishops should encourage having people, those review boards that you say in the diocese, but at parishes, and have many women in them. Because women, for the longest time, have been relegated to the sacristy, and women and their talents and their skills to deal with things like this are amazing. I've had that experience, and I would encourage pastors to not be afraid to have women around and in important review boards or in parishes, to make sure that the survivors are at the center, and that you can help them heal, and have places where they can go to be referred and be on top of that. That's not my problem, no, it is your problem. So have those people in the parish, in the diocese, to help.
Can I just also join in on that, because we haven't had time to talk about this, but there's clearly intersectionality here with the Me Too movement. And sexual abuse is a huge problem in our society, let's face it. And women have been the predominant victims of sexual abuse throughout society. What is extraordinary about the Catholic Church's abuse crisis is the way in which men have preyed on boys as well as girls, and children. That makes it even more horrific. But survivors of sexual abuse are all around, not just clergy abuse. And I think it's where the women of the church in particular just need to come out of our silent corners and say, this is an issue which has corrupted and debilitated so many lives of women, of men, of children. And we know something about this because we know about it in the rest of our lives. And we're dealing it every day in our secular lives all the time. So why don't we bring that power into the sanctuary, if you will, and bring the same fire of conviction that we have to root this out into the church as well. So bring it together. Bring it. Bring it.
Chris, you talked about the need for symbolic action as a way to carry forward our agenda. Bishop, you're part of a group. Is there any thought about gestures or examples of repentance, as was asked?
Well, like I said, it's just my job to cover it, not to come up with it. But I think, I saw the Tablet ran a piece today, the Tablet of the UK, about one of the first sort of monuments to survivors is being built. And things like that, I think, are important markers. The bishop can speak about the 8-day retreat that the U.S. bishops held last January at the urging of Pope Francis. Of course, that was for the bishops, but I don't know if you can speak to the sort of penitential aspect of that. But the Vatican Summit in February was organized around the themes of responsibility, accountability, and transparency. And just a very small but concrete gesture could be when the Pope accepts resignations of bishops that are accused of abuse or its cover-up. The Vatican needs to explicitly state that. To this date, when those announcements come out, they do not state that. And that's just a very small but I think significant measure that needs to be implemented right away.
Okay. Let's go to a couple more.
Well, they come to say something. Can I tell you? I know you're just reporting on it, Chris, so it's not you saying it, but survivors don't need any monuments. Trust me, they don't need any monuments. And even penitential acts by bishops laying on the ground and apologizing and singing the litanies, we don't need that. We need help, and we need it now. And we need the experience in the US, Bishop, I hope you can bring that, the experience in the US, bring it all over the world, because Chile, Peru, Costa Rica, India, Philippines, countries in Africa, that hasn't even happened, and it's starting to bubble up, and we need the good experience, not monuments for survivors. We need healing, help for survivors, and they need it now.
Okay, powerful. We're almost at the end of our time. I'm going to ask people's permission for another 5 or so minutes, and I'm going to ask the people who are in line to come forward and give us a brief comment or question, and then I'm going to ask the panel to try and respond.
The brief question I have is, how do we respectfully urge the curia and the hierarchy of the church to accept the increased participation of women and not view it as a threat?
Okay. Respect for and participation of women.
This is a follow-up probably to what's been said by our last person and Ms. Maguire. I'd like to ask the church why we think we're here right now. And if we expect people to come back to the church, don't we have to think about taking this learning experience and elevating it to all the other issues that we have, like equality. We speak highly of equality, but women aren't in, governing positions. So I think if we expect people to come back to the church, we have to look at taking our basic tenets and bringing them to a higher level. But that's, a question, a comment. If you're gonna, why are we here right now? Why is it such a crisis moment? And I would just note that I don't see millennials in church as much. I don't see a lot of moderates coming to us. And how can they with the betrayals and the contradictions? So we have a moment to do this.
Thank you. Brilliant young student from a wonderful seminar.
I'm one of Professor Carr's students this semester, and beyond millennials, I'm one of the few Gen Zers who still goes to Mass every Sunday here at Dahlgren. Against the odds, though, my question is, how do we dispel and challenge the notion that is common in church hierarchy that there is some sort of link between the sexual abuse crisis in the church and the acceptance of homosexuality in society?
We're really going for the softballs here. Women, homosexuality, come on up.
My question is that in my experience, Catholics are really bad at talking about all sex, including healthy sex. So how do we change this so that we get better at talking about what a healthy sexual relationship is? Because I feel like that probably influences this whole crisis.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about that. Anybody else waiting on that note? So, role of women, the link between the sex abuse crisis and homosexuality and our problems talking about sex in any way. I just thought that was an Irish problem, but apparently it's broader. And at this point, one last point you want to make, this would be the time to make it. Let's just go down the...
Sure. I'll start with the question on the link between abuse and homosexuality. Quite frankly, at the Vatican Summit in 2019, in February, There was just a pivot away from it. You know, the decision was made that, you know, the data is out there that proves that there is no link, and we're going to pivot away from that. And I think that's, you know, the smart thing to do. It's going to continue to fuel discussions on fringe Catholic websites, but I think for the most part that's what they are.
Okay. Bishop? Yeah. Bishop, your comment?
You know, why don't I talk a little bit about the role of women? It is important. It's not possible to really describe the kind of commitment and contribution that women have made over the centuries and millennia. We definitely need to work on that, without a doubt. I mean, we need to work on that and not just talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Kim?
Let me just very briefly say a couple things. I once, very recently, spoke to a high school class about women's leadership in the church. And the thing I did to start it off was just grab at my bookshelf in my office, the stack of books by women theologians and saints and leaders. I mean, we have a great history and tradition of women leaders in the church, so I don't want to have this conversation without being sure to raise that up. At the same time, that's not a way to take a pass on the very real need for an increased role of women's leadership in the church and in decision-making. If we believe in something that some might call a feminine genius and others might call a perspective that women bring to this question, it should be involved in these conversations. And finally, though, I would say that what we're here and what we're about and what Pope Francis talks about when he talks about conversion and how we get there is service to the least of these. This conference, this convening, was about returning to mission, making our voice heard, and that's what we want to make sure we are able to do.
Completely agree with what Kim says about women. I mean, you heard me before. Women are an important, critical part of the church. And I would ask bishops also to stop using homosexuality for the blame of everything that happens in the church. Look inside. And also, many survivors suffer this, right? Because when I was speaking 8 years ago for the first time, the cardinal in Santiago said to the media in front, like a press conference, well, Juan Carlos Cruz, maybe he's not a victim because he's gay and he might have liked it, 14 years old. So the pain they cause is unspeakable. So stop blaming homosexuality for everything. That's not the case. Yeah. Not you.
Well, yeah. When I'm the Pope, seriously, all of these questions are about the abuse of power. Let's be very clear. This is a discussion about the abuse of power. The issue of homosexuality, the issue of women, who has power, and who is afraid that other people will come along and take their power. And here's the antidote to that. We are the church. One of the things I think we need to understand is that we have power. We're not exercising it. We are not putting ourselves in the middle of this conversation in a way that is fruitful and healthy. We need to be advocates for our brothers and sisters who are the victim survivors. We need to be advocates for all those children. We need to be teaching the healthy rules of life, the social justice teachings of the church, and we need to be advocates for the church that we want to be. Not the church that is right now, which is so broken, but the church that we collectively, as the people of the church, see in the future. We need to have a synod of the laity of the church and come together and talk about the church that we can build together in the future with the bishops and the priests. We don't leave they left us out, but we won't leave them out. But we need to exert more of our power.
You may not be Pope, but you're dressed like a cardinal.
I know when to wear red.
Yeah.
It's also the Nationals color.
Yeah.
Also, John, the mystics, my final point. So the mystics didn't get a parade, and you know why? Because the women are paid so poorly, they had to go off to their second jobs immediately and didn't get a parade. That's the way the world works.
Do your own panel on that.
There you go.
A couple things at the end. I want to go back to the point about what people do with survivors. Some of you know I talked about my own experience for the first time on this stage less than a year ago, and it was a tough thing. And I was invited to be on the News Hour with Judy Woodruff. And I said, okay, I'll come on, but I want to talk about policy. I want to talk about programs. I don't want to be very personal. And they said, sure. And nobody told Judy Woodruff that. So she said, that's all very interesting, but let's talk about what happened to you. And as I've said, it was evil. It wasn't anything like what you experienced, but it was horrible. But I felt really awkward about that. And as I was leaving, one of the cameramen came up to me and shook my hand and said, thank you for doing that. That happened to me. So I think part of what we do with survivors is we listen and we stand with them. I want to close by suggesting another opportunity to follow through on what we do on lay leadership this Sunday at 4:30 in the afternoon at the Berkley Center. It's all on the website. We will have 4 lay leaders, remarkable people, talking specifically in a much smaller setting about this. If you're interested, it's on the flyer. On the 21st of November, we're going to have the Francis Factor Today. And that has our new Archbishop, Wilton Gregory, who is a leader in this area and has been for a long time. Helen Alvarez, lay woman, Latina leader on pro-life issues. And on this one, I've asked Kim to moderate because I want to be on the panel and tell you what I think about the Francis Factor. One very exciting thing at the end of January, we are going to have the Washington premiere of a PBS documentary on Dorothy Day, Revolution of the Heart, the Dorothy Day story. Hold your calendar for that. And then for those of you under 40, there's a special gathering on the 20th of November called Nationalism, Post-Liberalism, and Post-Francis. Get this lineup. Ross Douthat of the New York Times, Austin Ivory, the biographer of Pope Francis, Leah Labresco, writer for First Things in America, and Matt Sitman from Commonweal on this debate about where we fit in democracy and the rest. It's for under 40, but I think we're going to work it out so it'll be live streamed. So for us old people, we can sit in our recliners and watch. I want to thank Kim and Anna. Where's Anna here? Anna does all the work that makes this possible. Give them. Our student fellow, Tessa, Father Jerry, our partner at Georgetown. The report you will receive as you leave, hot off the presses, literally. Everything we've talked about here, the most consoling thought is that the important things that have been mentioned here are at the heart of the directions for action in this. We want to thank those who made it possible. And for those who actually produced this, our friend Amy at the Berkley Center. Most of all, I want to think, imagine what we would be like without journalists, without NCR, without the Boston Globe, without people like Chris White. Imagine where we would be without bishops who faced up to this and listened and learned from victims. Imagine where we would be without women leaders who take their skills and their knowledge and turn it into directions for action, like the Initiative for Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. Imagine where we would be without our own cardinal, Pat Maguire, who for 30 years has represented the best of Catholic higher education in a particular way, in a particular place, at a particular time. And most of all, imagine where we would be without survivors who called terrible names, told they were liars, never gave up, and in this case, found their way into the apartment of the Pope and said, you have to listen. imagine where we would be without that. Thank you very much.